Welcome back to the Mid-Atlantic Sports Report here on MASN. Joe McIlvaine, hired by the Orioles as a senior advisor of player personnel. He'll work with the front office staff and help the club scout with this season's amateur draft. Joe McIlvaine has been a big league front office man for many a year. Last 5 seasons with the Seattle Mariners. He's also been with the Minnesota Twins as a special assistant to the general manager, Mets executive vice president of baseball operations from 93 to 97. He was the Padres GM 90 to 93, the Mets assistant GM 85 to 90, and the Mets scouting director 81 to 85, and going way back to 1974 through 1976, a territorial scout for the Baltimore Orioles. And we welcome you back to our studios with Mel Anthony and Dave Johnson. I'm Tom Davis, and Joe McIlvaine joins us now live on the show. And Joe, I'm presuming that Frank Cashin helped you a little bit get into the off-field activities of Major League Baseball.
Well, you know, when you're a minor league player and you don't make the major leagues, your options are a little bit limited. So basically, I wrote to about 15 different teams about managing, coaching, scouting, and the only team that really gave me an interview was the Orioles. And they brought me down and interviewed me twice and ended up hiring me. Frank was the GM, and Dave Ritterpush was the scouting director, and Jim McLaughlin was the director of player personnel at that time. So between the three of them, they decided to give me an opportunity. Back then, most of the area scouts were 60 and 70 years old, and it was kind of a little bit revolutionary to hire a young guy to take over a territory, and that's what happened. They showed a lot of confidence and faith in me, and I've forever been, grateful for the opportunity they gave.
Joe, what's the challenge in being a scout, and how has scouting changed since you first started?
Well, when you first started, it was just pure scouting. You know, it was a lot easier to find a sleeper. It was, if you depended where your territory was, of course, but it's harder to find sleepers today that people don't know too much about. That seems like the prospects get sniffed out pretty early. And I think that's one of the biggest differences. I think another big difference is the money, obviously. I remember having in 1984, having the #1 draft pick in the country ended up being Sean Abner for $150,000. And today that doesn't take you too far. The money is obviously tremendously different. And I guess the third thing is how many more Latin players have come into the game than before. They've always come in, but they're really coming in now. I think almost 30% maybe of your minor league systems are players from Latin countries. So I think that's a big difference.
Joe, when you look back at your career, and Mel asked you kind of the difference between then and kind of now as far as scouting, but you were the scouting director for the Mets when I was actually facing some of your minor league teams. I was with the Pirates, and you guys had a Lynchburg Mets team that was just unbelievable in 1983. And you obviously drafted, some of those players had a lot to do with that. Of course, Dwight Gooden being maybe one of the most outstanding names in that group. But when you start talking about those type of players that you had, what type of group did you have kind of in those 2 or 3 years? And have you seen a group like that in your career going forward? Because those were some tremendous, talented drafts that you had.
Well, thank you. I think it just comes down to good scouts and good scouting, and just being able then to choose between the ones that the scouts liked. There's a lot of factors that go into the choice of a prospect, and I was very big into psychological testing as well, where I felt like it gave you indications, and most guys fall in the middle, so it really didn't work. But when you had guys on the one far side and guys on the other side, sometimes it was able to make a distinction for you because there's a lot of close calls when you're drafting. I think one of the things, too, is the quality of scout that you have out there. You have conservative scouts, you have liberal scouts, and you got to be able to read your scouts as a scouting director just like you read the players. And I think that's one of the keys also to, we didn't have as many cross-checkers at that time, too. So you'd have to go out yourself, but you'd have to come back every 2 weeks to do expense accounts and things like that. The hard thing back then, too, was you didn't have cell phones. And when you're on the road, you'd have to find yourself a roadside telephone if you're going to make a call to somebody. So that the things were a little bit different then as far as the communications and the reporting and things like that, simply because it just took longer. You had to send your reports in by mail, Sometimes it would take 3 days for them to arrive, or 4 days, whatever the case might be. So a lot of times your information wasn't always as current as it is today, where you get instantaneous.
Joe, it's interesting you bring up Dave Ritterpusch's name and back with the mental makeup, because he was a big military guy that really was involved in personal makeup. But from what you're seeing today in baseball with these young GMs now taking over, guys that are in their 30s, out of law school and whatever, are we being sort of like smashed with the sabermetrics and the whole thing of scouting, what you were just talking about recently, is sort of like being pushed aside for all these numbers that are being created in baseball now?
Well, that's a very good question, and we certainly get asked that a lot these days. I think that even when I was a scouting director and a general manager, you used numbers. I mean, you're crazy when you don't look at the numbers of players, not so much at the amateur level, but at the professional level, particularly AA and up, because they begin to establish a performance level. And certainly that's a factor in any decision. But there's more to that, because your product is a human being. It's not a pair of shoes, it's not a suit of clothes, it's not paper or anything like this. It has good days, it has bad days. Guys come in, their child may be sick and in the hospital. There are just so many factors that go into, and what you're trying to find more than anything else is who has the staying power to overcome resistance. We've always found that the three main things were self-confidence. You got to believe you can do it. Second thing was emotional control, and that was basically the ability to play with pressure on. And the third thing is mental toughness, because you play baseball 7 days a week. It's unlike football, where you get a week to think about it. It's unlike basketball and hockey, where you play 3 times a week. You're playing every single day. You can't worry about that 0 for 4 yesterday or that 4 for 4 yesterday. You got to be focused on today. And I think that offers a lot of challenge, and you need to find out as much as you can about the player prior to the time you sign him. You know, what's he got inside him. And that's where psychological makeup helps a lot. You know, it's certainly not 100% right all the time, but it certainly helps if you have a pretty good insight into what makes that young man tick.
Joe, you're coming into draft season now. What's the first step in getting ready and prepared for the draft coming up?
Well, I think that today the players are identified a lot sooner, and the publications certainly put their names out there for you, so that a lot of the key guys have already been identified. I think, and you're going to look at each of these players and realize that the biggest change in a player, in my opinion, over 40 years of scouting, comes between his junior and his senior year of high school. Maybe they add 20 pounds, they get bigger. Things happen. And a lot of times you'll look at some of these juniors that you kind of liked a little bit, that showed you something. You come back for senior year and you go, whoa, this guy's a whole lot better. And I think one of the things that I always look for, when you get a physically mature high school player, sometimes it's a little bit of a red flag, because they may not get a whole lot more better. I like those ones that their bodies are still developing, and you can just see them and project a little bit more. It's the same with college guys. You know, when you look at guys with fully mature bodies, sure, some of them are going to play in the big leagues, but their margin for getting a whole lot better is not always as good sometimes as that guy that's still a little bit growing into his body. So they're just a few things that we have always looked for, especially in pitchers. You know, when you get that tall, lanky pitcher with the good arm action, take them, you know, because a lot of times in 2 years they're going to be a whole lot better.
Joe, we appreciate the information, the conversation. Look forward to seeing you possibly in Sarasota down there when the Orioles are going to have spring training and during the baseball season upcoming at Camden Yards.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. It's for me, it's an opportunity. I live right outside of Philadelphia, too, and I've been working in the West Coast teams and the Midwest League team, and the Midwest part of the country teams as well for the last 17, 18 years. So this is a nice thing for me to be able to work out of Florida and to live only 100 miles from Baltimore.
Joe, we appreciate the conversation. We'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate you calling me.